Thank you, John, for joining us.
Yeah, thank you, Colleen, for the invite, and hello, everyone. Yesterday I had my first face-to-face meeting in 3 years, and it was refreshing to actually do so. So it's and I get a bit tired of doing this electronically all the time, but anyway, that's the way the world is at the moment. So okay, I don't have a presentation to give you in a sense, but Colleen's provided some idea of a scope of what to talk about. So I sometimes tend to ramble a little bit too. So, you know, if I do, I apologise up front, but sometimes it's easy to just answer questions. But anyway, we'll see how we go, eh? Okay, the Working with Children check. Well, just to give you a little bit of background on me, I've been in the state public service for not quite 50 years, but getting seems like it, getting close to it. I used to work in DOCS. I was the director of the Office of Childcare, and I was in Child Protection Policy as a manager there. And I kind of retired, and then a friend of mine was working at the Commission for Children and Young People, called me in to do some work, and that was 2007. So we then, the check moved over to the Office of the Children's Guardian, where we sit now. So I've been working in the check area since around 2007. And of course, we've had a big change with this current check coming in 2013. So that's what brings you into it, because at that time, the decision was made to extend the check out to include volunteers, because previously it was only ever for paid people who were unsupervised working with children, and it was a much narrower check than what the current one is. So, but in extending the check to volunteers, the minister at the time was also the Minister for Volunteering, and the government did not want to unduly impact on the administration work done by volunteer organisations, or in fact, impact on family participation in activities that their children were participating in. And so when drafting the legislation, they included a range of exemptions and inclusions, and there are those in other areas as well within the check. So basically, the Working with Children check is a part of proper recruitment practice when recruiting somebody to work face-to-face with a child or children. That's why it's called the Working with Children check. That's the purpose of it, is to be part of recruitment checking, and it's mandatory for the roles where defined in the legislation. It is a law, and as a law, it has certain conditions and stipulations, and it has exemptions and exclusions in it. That's basically the reason for it, to try and stop people being employed to work with children who may represent, whose history represents a risk in working with children. So it is not for, in 2012, when the legislation was being reviewed, that was around, 2017, when the legislation was being reviewed, that was around the time of the Royal Commission into institutional responses to child sexual abuse. And the Commission came up with a whole lot of recommendations which the state government implemented in terms of the Working with Children check. So the legislation was amended at that time to restrict even more so who it was for, because what the Commission found was that a number of organisations in child-related work that were using the check were doing so beyond the requirements of the law, and were actually, children were being abused because organisations were thinking, well, we're okay, everyone's got the check. So, which is not the case whatsoever, because we're barring people all the time who've got checks. So it's not the case that just because a person has a check, is that it's not a good person test. It is actually, part of pre-employment screening to work directly face-to-face with children, or in another role that's defined in the legislation. So yeah, the incidental contact, I think, was what was included at that time to make it a bit clearer that it's actually about working with children, and it's not the working where children are checked, or or I might come into contact doing my job checks. It is actually for people who are being employed to work directly with children. So that's the purpose, I guess, behind it. What the Commission recommended there was that it's what people do in their organisation that keeps children safe. It's not necessarily a working with children check, because, as I said, we're barring people all the time who have checks. So it's just a point in time thing. So the Commission came up with 10 standards that went to making an organisation a child-safe organisation. And the government has mandated those in law, and we are moving towards implementing those, and they become compliance as required from next February for those organisations that are captured by that scheme. So that's kind of a bit of background around it. The process. So the process then, or do you want to ask me questions as we go along, or how do you want to? I'm open to how you want to do it. So if people want to wait till the end and ask questions, or
I'm happy if anyone else wants to jump in with questions as we go, but I think you're doing great. It's kind of just giving a bit of context around it. I think that's fantastic. Does anyone have any kind of questions that they'd want to address as we go, or perhaps we can let John carry on and field questions at the end?
I do have a question related to what you mentioned, John, about impacting participation levels. We're going through a similar thing at the moment with trying to find that balance between how strict or stringent you are with working with children check, but obviously not wanting to turn away parent helpers or volunteers. I guess, do you have an insight there on when a parent helper crosses over into a volunteer that would require a check in your eyes, or in the organisation's the policy guidelines?
Well, Daniel, I actually had a Teams meeting this morning with one of your clubs.
Oh, good. Was it the Hills by any chance?
It was.
Yeah.
Well, it was one in that kind of area. Anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah. So when I can't really, one of the problems that we get to is that organisations come to us saying that wanting us to comment on a scenario, and so we kind of try to push back, because we're not there. We don't know. All scenarios are different. So what we can say, and we're not lawyers, all we can say is what the law says.
Yeah.
And when we do compliance work, what we look for. So, but most of our compliance work, I suppose I'm jumping ahead a bit here, but most of our compliance work is around whether a person has a check, and if they're then verified, because the verification is extremely important.
Yeah.
So it's up to the organisation to determine, according to the information we provide on our website and the law, as to whether a check's required. So if you come from the point of view, are we engaging this person to work with children? And if we look at the law and there's no exemption or exclusion for that kind of work, then they get a check.
Yeah. Okay. Right. That helps.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So, all right. Well, I'll keep going then. Okay. All right. The process. So the process. Well, there's a process for the employer and for the applicant. So my part of it is around the employer, not around the applicant. But an applicant, I think you all know the process of how you go about it, or should know about it. So I don't know how much I need to talk about the process, but an employer registers with us online, and then they verify their workers who are in child-related work. I guess the next item was about consequences. So I guess what falls out of that is the consequences. We're a very small team, and we've got something like 59,000 employer registrations at the moment. Around 20,000 of those are removed from the system because they don't work with kids. the check is incredibly overused. When the Act was reviewed back in 2017, there was an interest in looking at whether we would implement a fee, because I think New South Wales is still the only state that doesn't charge a fee for the check because of the overuse of it. A couple of years ago, we did a review, part of our auditing work, on volunteer checks that were being renewed and never verified. Okay, and there was a huge component of those. So that's quite a bit of work, because you've got to contact the person, find out why they got the check, and you don't always get the person on the first phone call. So there's a lot of work goes into these kind of things. And we was just looking at, well, why were the people getting the check? And a lot of people just got it because they could. So what happens there, and all the time, like I think the last week I've dealt with 4 builders. They just thought they'd get the check because they might do work at a school. It's not because they required it, but they, and I don't know what your view on technology is, but I know that a lot of people don't read these days. No one reads anything. They like to be told things or to see it on their phone, but they don't actually go into a lot of detail in reading. I know myself, if I go onto a website, I want to do what I want to do, not have to go through a lot of malarkey. So anyway, that's just the way of the world.
Sorry, John, you're just saying that people are getting working with children's check even though they're not working or volunteering with children. There's no need for them to have a check. Absolutely.
Lots. Absolutely.
I can't believe that.
Oh, well, I'm afraid it happens. I mean, just the other day, and what happens, okay, I'll give you an idea of what the consequence of this is. So we're not a large organisation, and there's a lot of people doing risk assessments. Now, risk assessments means that you go into a lot of detail with a person, because these aren't people that are automatically barred. They're people that they've had their history reviewed, and they look at their history and they contact the person in some way to try and get them to participate in that process. Now, we did have a person who was, there was a costing done on a person who was barred, and a volunteer check. And he said, I don't work with kids, I don't need this, it's just my employer wants me to have the check or I lose my job. So we did a costing here, it took us to court, okay, $250,000 for that. He didn't need it. So, yes, no, it's happening all the time, I'm afraid. Kate, yeah, it is just all the time. So it's just one of those things, about the law these days. We have a lot of organisations require it. As a matter of fact, I was dealing with a Commonwealth agency just the other day who's registered as an employer, and so I asked, well, how do you actually work with children? Because it wasn't clear that they did face to face, and they can't. They said, oh, it's just a matter of policy. So they don't actually meet the legislation. The other part of the consequence, so there's a consequence on our work that we do. So we've got people who legitimately require a check, okay, and it delays it. It delays the processing of that check by all these ones coming in. And it's not just our work, it's also the national checking system. So, I mean, all the checks are funneled through ASIC, the police. So the more checks they get, well, the longer it takes to process them if there's something there. And so, yes, we, and sometimes it's the vulnerable people or disadvantaged people like Aboriginal people who just want to do labouring work. And they got someone saying, well, no, you've got to have a working with children check to do that. So it is, unfortunately, and so they don't get employed then because they can't get a working with children check to dig holes. So, that's just the way it is at the moment. It's, yeah. So
just to add to that, John, we see it quite a bit where we've heard of volunteer involving organisations that are using the working with children check as a screening mechanism.
Yes.
Whether or not people are working with children, and they've just built it in as part of their process that everyone that wants to volunteer with them needs of working with children check.
That's just a massive waste of money and time and resources, isn't it?
Yes.
Massive.
Yeah. So
Anyway.
I had a Teams meeting with a volunteer organisation up here in the Blue Mountains just the other week. They're registered as an employer, and see, they had one of the people they verified was barred. So we then need to find out what kind of work that person's actually in child-related work, because the legislation is all couched around child-related work. So disclosure from us about a change in status has to be child-related work. So when we contact the employer, we make an inquiry that is child-related work. If not, we can't disclose. So this particular organisation, I did a Teams meeting with the chap, and yes, that's exactly what he said, Colleen. They did no reference checking, no recruitment. It was just they used the working with children check. So, I mean, they did actually have people in their organisation that did need the check, but like one person out of, and they were using it as membership. So to be a member of the organisation, you had to provide your check. And that happens quite a lot. And it's rife in sport. There's a lot of sports that, have a computer system. And for you to be a coach, you've got to put your name in their computer system along with your working with children check. And if you don't do that, then you can't be a coach in that sport.
John, so the police checks and the working with children checks pick up different things, do they? Because I always wondered, I mean, if you're a volunteer and you're supporting someone who's under 18 who's on the NDIS, so they've got to get a police check, a working with children's check and an NDIS worker screening check, which just seems...
Yes, well, I can't talk about the politics of it, but I mean, I can say that the working with, I got this, when I met with this face-to-face group yesterday, which is a volunteer organisation, a large one, Australia-wide one. And yes, they asked the question about do we need to get the national police check as well as working with children check? Well, the working with children check only looks at the offences in our legislation, right? We don't look at other things in there. So we don't look at anything to do with fraud or driving offences or anything else that might happen to be in there. Ours is around violence and sexual offences. So yeah. So that's why I say it is a part of proper probity checking. So when you're recruiting somebody, you should ask them to give you a police check. So that's because then you get all the records. We cannot disclose. We often get organisations coming to us wanting to know why a person is barred or whatever, and we cannot disclose that. So it is a good point. So consequences, yeah, there is that impact on the system and on our workload and on the fact that we can't disclose things. There is also, some years ago, I saw a blurb that came out from a HR company about privacy and privacy legislation, to be careful, what kind of information you're obtaining about people because of stepping on their privacy. So when a person applies for a check, they give consent to a range of disclosures. They give consent to their name and details going to the police system for 5 years. And they also give consent to disclosure of the result of the check to their employer, no matter if they're exempt. So we changed the consent several years ago because there were so many people who were exempt applying for the check and being barred that we had to, turn around and change the consent so we could actually tell their employer. What the employer then does is then up to them. But yeah, so there are impacts like that. So in obtaining information from our system, we're verifying a check. It needs to be child-related work, and you need to be an employer in child-related work because that's what the consent for disclosure is about. So that could be a contravention of Commonwealth privacy law. But there's a whole that's a whole other area. I'm not an expert in that area, but there is a possibility that it is.
John, I had a question just in your example when you talked about like a volunteer organization that was using the working with children check as a blanket check, even though some people weren't working directly with children. And then there was was a question of whether you could disclose that issue that person had with their working with children check. Does that, I mean, if that person is working alongside children, does that mean that you still, like if they were working stacking shelves, for example, at an op shop or something, and you'd have an adult working alongside a child, does that mean you still couldn't disclose that person had a barred offence, even though they might be working alongside children?
Well, working alongside children is an exemption. So if it's an exemption, we can disclose, because they waive that, you see, when applying for the check. So it depends on what they do. But if they're not, there's no children, they're just out in the back room stacking boxes, then no, we can't disclose. It has to be child-related work. So I mean, you could argue that that's not child-related work in the first place, because but it isn't actually an exemption. But the exemption is if it is child-related work, so it's a bit convoluted. Hopefully, our legal people are saying that the regulation will get reviewed next year. So it was due to be reviewed in 2019, because hopefully it will be reviewed then, and the Act as well. So.
Can I just ask quickly before you move on? We work in the Sydney Children's Hospital Foundation, and there's a couple of different areas we don't want to use the system where it's not needed. We quite often get young work experience people into the office and that with us. Are we then required to have our working, sorry, I've got my little one home from school now. Are we then required to have the working with children's check, even though they're coming into our place of work for work experience?
No. Work experience is that working alongside, that's an exemption.
Okay, and the other one is sometimes we'll have like art therapists and art teachers go into wards, maybe just like a one-off or a two-off throughout a 12-month period. Is there a cut-off, like how many times we can bring someone in on a one-on-one, or is if they come in just for a one-off visit with a patient at their bedside, they're then required to have that check beforehand?
Yeah, well, it comes down to, are you employing those people? Who's employing them?
Well, they're coming in through the foundation, but they might be coming in on different things. I'm just asking as a general, because we're starting to head down that path now that the COVID restrictions are lifting. We're starting to be able to head back into the wards. Yeah. So we're just checking off our... It's
important things.
That's right.
Look, I always have to go back to the legislation. So to give you a proper answer. So if you want to send me an email, sorry.
Sure.
You're right.
No, that's fine.
I'd rather look at it a bit more closer. So and give you the proper answer. So if you
that'd be great.
Send me an email, then I'll
Thank you.
That. But I'd say the probability is, well, I do know that there is an exception around working less than 5 days a year if there are other adults around.
Yep.
But working in a hospital setting, there's some differences in that legal definition around a hospital setting, around children's services. Okay?
No worries. Thank you.
I'd need to look at that. It might be different.
Okay, thanks.
Right. Now, resources. Our website's full of resources. There's lots of resources on the website, including videos. Our child safe team's always developing, continually developing different kinds of resources. So I fully recommend, looking at our website, because there's information on there, not just about the check, but also about child safe scheme, which I think is a pretty important initiative, because basically, as I said before, like, the check doesn't actually keep kids safe. It's what people do that keeps kids safe. So that was pretty quick, but so if people have got questions, I don't know if there's much more I can actually talk about. Probably is, but
I see there was a question in the chat regarding, do organisations working with vulnerable people with disabilities require a working with children check?
Well,
I suppose it just depends if those those with disabilities are children or not. Is that correct?
That's right. But I mean, again, you always go back to what the law says. So the law, we have the Act and the regulation. So the Act, that gives you the broad scope, and the regulation goes into more detail. So in terms of working with children with a disability, it's a lot more restrictive in scope than other parts of the work sectors. I think it might be because the person who developed the whole scheme had a child with a disability, and so I think back in those days it was about limiting it to people who presented more of a risk, and so the risk wasn't there. So if the worker wasn't working alone, so the legislation says that for a check to be legally required for working with a child with a disability, you have to have basically your client group 51% are children, and you work alone with those children, no other adults at all. So,
so if you're working with someone with a disability that's an adult, you won't require the check. Is that correct?
oh, absolutely not. No, absolutely not. You need the NDIS worker check, but you don't need the working with children check. No, they're not children. Did have an organisation some years ago but they were getting a lot of barred people, and wondering why they were having so many barred people, and looked into what they did, and they were mostly people from jail doing community service, and you know, again, packing shells or packing boxes or whatever, had nothing to do with kids at all. But they were working from a facility where there was also a disability service, and so they said, oh, well, they're like kids anyway, aren't they? So, which was a pretty horrible thing to say, but you know, like, so again, that's you know, not the right use of the check. So yeah, no, it's got to be working with children, not adults. Okay. We have had some things with, you know, like hearing, we hear from people that, you know, they go into nursing homes or aged care facilities or whatever, and that they require them to have a check. Well, unfortunately, there's no offence in the legislation to stop people requiring the check when it's not required by law. But as I said, there are consequences and impacts of requiring it outside the law, because it also diminishes the importance of the check in keeping kids safe. Are there other questions? Well, I'll mention one then. I don't know if there's anyone here. One of the ones we pick up quite a lot, although I haven't had recently, but was people volunteering or going to work overseas, with children in overseas countries being required to get our check. It has no validity whatsoever. So anyone doing that, the person's barred, we can't tell you. So, you know, like you're better off doing your own police checks on them. So the other thing about the check is also it's only valid within New South Wales, or we've worked with New South Wales children elsewhere. So with the overseas, if a school, for example, took a group of kids on a overseas excursion, like his kids, then the teachers going with them would have to have checks. Of course, they'd have to have checks for being here, but if, you know, they took other people who didn't have checks, then they'd be required to have checks to go on that trip.
John,
working with New South Wales children.
Sorry, I was going to ask about the states, because we're so good at doing everything together as states. Sorry. So if someone commits an offence against children in another state, what's the story there? You just have to do a check in every single state?
No, well, it's a national check. So when the check's done, it picks up offences wherever they are.
Yeah.
So you get a national record of it.
But you do have to, if I went and worked in another state, I've got to do another working with children's check in that
yes,
state.
there's no national check, no. There's no national check.
But it does pick up national offences.
Yeah, and there is now a national reference system. So all the people that are barred or whatever they're called, negative notice or whatever it is elsewhere, are all put on this system. So all the jurisdictions can look into that system.
Right. Yeah. And would it be logical to have one check for the whole country? I know, it's funny.
I worked in national programs for a long while. I mean, I try to remember, I think it was back in the 90s, there was, what's it called now? Something to do with law. But it's not expulsion, it's something to do with criminal offences. But anyway, lots of work has gone into that over the years, and yeah, Victoria won't have a bar of it. So whatever it is, no, getting a national program out of anything once you've got state ones. I mean, if you think about it, like I'm not blowing a trumpet here to say that we're right, but New South Wales was the first one to bring in the check, and so why didn't all the others that followed do the same thing? So they didn't. They all did opposite. So in a sense, because we based our check, the onus was on the employer. Everyone else put the onus on the applicant. So I think that was because they could charge them a fee. So I don't know. But then when we reviewed ours in 2012, we changed ours around to be consistent with everybody else's. So
yes, because they're all different from state to state. So we deal all over Australia. So I have a spreadsheet of all the different laws, and people some of them have multiple working with children's checks because they travel between states. So
yep, yes,
yeah, and it's tricky.
My son is in HR in a national organisation. Yes.
Yep. And I know with the New South Wales, there was something about 30 days and there's 5 days as well. Reading the legislation sometimes. So if we ever, obviously I just send an email if I'm not sure about something, but we do our best to make sure that they get whichever state they need to have. So
yeah, well, with the it's been an interesting one, that 30 days, because with the pandemic, we had a lot of inquiries, not recently, but going back a year or so, about people working in interstate doing online work into New South Wales. So there's no requirement for them to have a New South Wales check if they depend on what their jurisdiction laws say in that respect. So especially telehealth. So
right.
But our clause for online work is around distance education, mentoring, and counselling, but it has to be provided from within New South Wales. So,
right, okay.
if it's online, yeah.
Thank you.
But otherwise, yes, there's that 30 days, can work in New South Wales for 30 days.
Yeah, thank you.
On an interstate check. It's probably there for people who are, maybe employed just for a short period, or they've come in here whilst they apply for a New South Wales check.
And then we notice overnight stays. I've went around the country and I've got the spreadsheet. There's only 1 or 2 states that we still don't allow it, but that most of them it's absolutely no for an overnight stay, regardless. So if they have to have a
Right.
New South Wales check, so
Right.
yeah, it gets a bit tricky.
Yes, it does. Yeah, for national organisations. Yeah. Also, with the new provision that came in with the head of a child safe organisation, have to have it working with children check, and that doesn't matter where they're domiciled. They have to have a New South Wales check because they're seen as having input into the running of that organisation, and that person should be above it.
John, this might be a little bit outside of the kind of the scope of what you do at the Office of Children's Guardian, but are there penalties for discriminating against people by excluding them from your programs for example, having a work with children check that's not relevant? Like having an irrelevant criminal record is one of the protected attributes in the discrimination law. Are you aware of the what if any penalties there are for that kind of infringement?
No, the only thing I can say is that what we say to people is that if you require somebody to have a check who's legally not required and you dismiss them from employment or don't employ them because of that, our legislation provides no protection if they take action against you, any legal action. So, yeah. I think is that what you're meaning?
Yeah, exactly. I was just trying to find out what the kind of implications of that are. If there's,
Yes,
considerations.
I wish I'd followed up. There was a rugby league, a parent who wanted to volunteer coaching his son's team, but they didn't like him. But rather than having the guts to not engage him as a volunteer and say for any other reason, they wanted him to get a working with children check, and he refused to do it. And so they actually came to us and they said, can you stop telling people about the exemption? Oh, no.